Presenter for today. Very warm welcome to Peter Kandefer. And I apologize, I don't know if it's Dr. Peter Kandefer, professor. I don't know if there's a title in front of that, but you're warmly welcomed for your presentation on the latest in Stonehenge astronomy.
Let's just say Mr. Past ASGH President.
Oh,
and,
well, let's see.
And past member, of course.
Well, there you go. It's the best title of all.
Yes.
So.
And co-founder of StarConn.
Yeah, there you go as well. Yeah, we could say an awful lot about Pete, but I think I'm going to let turn it over to Pete now. He's already sharing his screen. I'm going to keep track of people coming in late. I'm just saying that Pete has spent a significant amount of years studying Stonehenge, traveling to Stonehenge, and experiencing and understanding the astronomy of Stonehenge. And he is probably my favorite local authority. Without being a professor or a visiting scientist, he's become our local scientist. And with that introduction, Pete, please introduce yourself further and take it away.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you tonight. And as a electrical engineer, I've had to work with some pretty high tech, of course, in my many years. I primarily work out of the Litchfield Hills Club, and we do have observing sessions up at the White Memorial in Litchfield. But in my travels, took me to England twice. And I was traveling with another engineer, and I said, why don't we detour on the way to Wales? Why don't we just detour over to a little place called Stonehenge? And I traveled with twice and with two different engineers, and the reaction each time was, Stone Age Neanderthals built this? No, these were real people. They had made the first transition to living in a farming community. They were not the howling barbarians that some people have thought they were, but the area around Stonehenge is actually more ancient than people have realized in the past, primarily because of the discovery. So what I'm going to talk about is to give you a little background of what the area contains. I'll then get into a little bit of the astronomy and show you what people like Hawkins had come up with, and whether or not they're right or wrong, because there are some inconsistencies. And once I was there for the first time, I couldn't get enough of it, and I just wanted to learn a little bit more. To get into some of the stuff, this is what we imagined Stonehenge looked like at one time. You'll see that there's a large sarsen circle of 30 upright stones capped by a lintel on top. That takes you up to about 15 feet off the ground. And the horseshoe with the very large, what we call trilithons, just a 3-section stone, takes you anywhere from 20 to 25 feet. Now, in between the sarsens and the trilithons that are in the horseshoe, you'll see a circle of bluestones, small bluestones in between. And then once you transition inside the trilithons, you'll see an open oval, and it has 19 stones. Now, what's the possible significance of 19? Well, we're going to get into that. Outside of the sarsen circle, you'll just see a hint of 2 stone sets of markers, and there's a third one way out there. The inner ones that you see in this picture have 30 in the outside ring and 29 stones in the inside ring, and you're going to find out why 29 and 30 are important. Well, the word henge implies a hanging stone, but there were no hangings taking place. But to an archaeologist, this is a completely different word. It's called a bank and ditch circular enclosure. Now, the bank can be on the inside of the ring, dug into the chalk ground, or it could be on the outside. For Stonehenge, it's on the inside, and it's classified as a different type of a henge. But the picture on the left now shows you a place called Robin Hood's Ball. And disregard the classified image at the circle at the top, because that's part of the Larkhill military installation. So when you're driving through this area, there are little signs everywhere. Watch out for tank crossing, because there are airplanes flying over, and there are occasionally tanks crossing over the territory. So there's a little bit of a road hazard. The picture on the right shows you an area that's been excavated only in the last few years called Durrington Wall. And this was a large henge. You can see the ditch that's been thrown up to form a bank all around the situation. That's in the background. There's a road that goes right through there. And you'll see a circular area in the front of the picture on the right. And that's an area called Woodhenge. I mean, it's not actually any kind of astronomical thing, but there were timbers put into the ground in 6 circular rings. So a henge is a little bit different. Even though Stonehenge gave its name to the word, archaeologists say it's a ditched circular enclosure. Well, let's just take a look at the one on the left again. There are 2 concentric rings. This area has been plowed over and farmed for quite a while. You can see there's roads there, and there actually were cutouts called little causeways. So technically, the Robin Hood Ball, which is shown on the left, is really as a causewayed enclosure. So I don't know why the archaeologists do this, but they don't listen to the astronomers. And neither one of us, astronomers or archaeologists, pay any attention to the geologists. Well, to give you an even better idea, there's quite a bit of stone masonry all over here. The unit itself is Stonehenge, is oriented to the northeast for midsummer sunrise. And what you see here are all the outer rings. You'll see very close to the center an arrow going down called the Sarsen Circle, which are the 30 uprights. And well inside there, you'll see a horseshoe-shaped circular area where the trilithons are located. It turns out that nowadays the northeast and east and southeast sections of Stonehenge are still erect and maintain a good figure. Apparently, the archaeologists feel that the southwest side wasn't put together that well, so that there's more of those have fallen down. But once you cross the entrance through what they call the avenue, there's a small entrance there. You'll come to walk right over the ditch, which surrounds all of Stonehenge, and immediately as you enter, there are these 56 stones which were discovered by John Aubrey in 1771. Within those, I mentioned that there are 2 other circles of stones even before you get to the Sarsen Circle. And originally, the Aubrey holes were called the X holes, and the Y holes and the Z holes sort of follow in place. Again, we have 30 holes, and then again 29 holes. And we'll describe what that was used for a little bit later on. Well, the stones themselves have been shaped considerably. And in fact, the trilithons have a flat interior, which was created by picking up a 10 to 30 pound piece of dolerite for those geologists in the audience and smashing it repeatedly on the back of the Sarsen uprights, especially on the trilithons. Now, the picture on the right just shows you some of how it's organized. You can see it's kind of flat on the interior because this was made to be viewed from the inside by a select clientele of people, whether you call them shamans or priests of some sort. It's up to you. But these people did have quite a bit of intelligence, and they were not the howling barbarians that some people thought they were. There was quite a bit of ingenuity in putting those stones up there. You can see that all the sarsens and the trilithons are put together this way. The picture on the right shows the way you would put up a sarsen stone on the outside with two lintels joined together. They pop over a mortise, which is carved into the top of the stones like you see in the picture on the left. There are hollowed out spots in there for the mortise and tenon. Also note something very peculiar, that the lintels are carved and grooved like they're a piece of woodwork. That's called tongue and groove. So there's actually quite a bit of shaping and polishing of the stones so that they can withstand 4,500 years of weathering and abuse. Outside the circle and very close, this is an old picture because there was a road that was eliminated in 2003 where these people are standing in the picture on the left. This is the heel stone itself. The word heel stone is an old term. It was originally applied to stone number 14, but somehow or other since the 18th century, that word has been applied to the heel stone, which is the sighting device for picking out the sun at the moment of sunrise. Another stone that's laying outside the circle is this thing called the slaughter stone. That may have been a group of 3 stones, of which only one is exposed at the present time. That one is a completely different kind of stone. The heel stone and the sarsens and the trilithons are made of a sandstone called sarsen, which means a thorn, but it stands upon the Salisbury chalk plain itself, which stretches all the way from Kent even further west than Stonehenge, which is about 2/3 of the way over to Wales. But the ground itself is not level. You would have thought that people putting up any kind of construction would have leveled out the ground. Well, the heel stone itself may have been upright completely. It's tilted 27 degrees. The picture on the right shows the way that I saw it. And there were some interesting things there because you actually took a tunnel to cross the road there, and you came up through a winding, curving, zigzag path, and all of a sudden you're there. I mean, it doesn't look impressive until you walk right up to it practically, and it's just dominating. You can no longer reach inside the interior unless you get a special exemption. But by 1993, the English House of Commons had figured out that this was a national disgrace. And then about 2010 to 2013, they dug up the road, made a new visitor center way down the road. But the picture on the left shows something that you can no longer see. This is a picture from the old car park, and it held 4 large timbers. The Salisbury Plain was originally very forested from about 14,700 years ago, and the chalk sort of and the climate changed so that it became an open plain. Now these were essentially 30-foot poles that were 2.5 feet wide, so you can imagine some of the timber that used to grow in that area. The picture on the right shows you what it may have looked like from about 8,000 BC or 10,000 years ago. Well, when they dug up the old car park, they excavated these timber holes, dated them, so that we have a very firm picture of that time, and they promptly buried it, so you can no longer see these white circles, which are the oldest part of Stonehenge. It definitely shows the presence of people. And Stonehenge itself was an occupied area that attracted some attention. This is a gentleman by the name of John Aubrey who made a trip through there during a fox hunt with some other notables from his area, and he had never heard of it. And he sort of started the antiquarian field in England at the time, and he actually called attention to the circle of 56 stones that were surrounding Stonehenge, and he even wrote down for the first time that it looked like it was oriented to the summer sunrise. And the 56 stones were promptly lost to the grass and vegetation until the 1920s, when another archaeologist by the name of Newall came in and as part of Hawley's expedition to recapture some of this material and find out more about it. Well, another guy who participated in the early excavations there, I shouldn't say excavation, but discovery, but he identified some areas that were around Stonehenge, including the access road, which is called the Avenue. Other constructions out there were he noted as the cursive. Both Aubrey and Stukely had a very firm idea that the Druids built this, but the Druids arrived about 1,000 years after Stonehenge was built. So that Stukely, in his firm belief that he even tried to draw a picture of himself. So that drawing is an artist's conception of what Stukely looked like as a Druid priest. And of course, if any one of you have studied Latin, you may have come across some writings from the Roman times about their dealings with the Druids. They were not very happy with the Druids, yelling curses at them all the time. Now, here's an example. So people were working with wood long before they started really working with stone. The artist's conception on the right is not roofed, and it never did have a roof. It had 6 concentric rings of stone posts, which sort of give it the idea that maybe there were different groups of people that were entitled to sit towards the center, and maybe someone else was an area on the outside. But they would have all been using this wood henge as a meeting place to discuss things that were going on in their area. The same thing with other things, like Avebury is a site about 25 miles away. It's also ringed with stones, and it's right in people's backyard. But amazingly, it's still open. Imagine, if you will, the houses are now gone in the picture on the left, and most of the stones have been incorporated into those houses or transported elsewhere. And with almost 1,100 feet across, you had 2 Stonehenge-sized circles in that area, built around 2800 to about 2500 BC. Now, it's kind of amazing, but you can walk around this thing and see the bank over the picture of that lady with the dog, and there's quite a bit of excavation of material to try to create, just like at Stonehenge, to try to create an artificial horizon, only in this case, you're outside the ditch. So this is a classical henge for Avebury, but it's a formative henge for Stonehenge. Well, also in the area are this one gigantic mountain. It was man-made, built on a small ridge of chalk, and people actually spent years putting together dirt, which they could have used to farm, to build it up to about 128, 129 feet. Picture on the right shows you an aerial view of some of the surroundings. There are all these little dimples that are in the ground that are actually burials that date by either 2800 to about 2500 or 2400 BC. Prior to that, people were buried in long barrows, which are rectangular funerary monuments of stone and dirt. I should say that they made a transition between burying groups of people in long rectangular barrows to these circular depressions in the ground, which come in 5 different shapes. Despite 2 excavations in Silbury Hill here on the left, no grave possessions or grave bones or artifacts were ever found there, but it was built at the time when another population of people came in there. So what they had to work with is things like deer antlers, which they could break up and even attach to wooden sticks, and actually fashion round stones to use to pound into the sarcens, which are the very tough sandstone, believe it or not. When people started visiting this area in the 1800s, early 1800s, they were actually sold hammers at the various hotels where they lived so they could take a piece of the rock back with them. And that does show up on some of the stones. You have to look really close for that, human desecration, even 200 years ago. Well, construction is a chore. It probably went something along like this, but nobody really knows how they likely hauled all these timbers or hauled all the rocks on top of that and erected them. It turns out that there's an interesting quarry for the sarcens, which has been positively identified. And look, in the picture on the right, there's actually pretty close to a pillar shape, so that there's a little bit of work involved in finalizing, but these were stones that were laying on the ground and only 20 to 5 miles away. Well, that's interesting because this is a stone called just the sarsen, and other stones had to be transported in from Wales, where I ended up working for a while. There actually is a place out there called the Pacelli Mountains, and people are still arguing about what overland route they took to get there. The geologists now that nobody listens to, especially the archaeologists, the geologists now say these bluestone, completely different kind of rock called spotted dolerite, came from either the north side of these mountains or the south side, depending on which theories you believe. They either transported them around the north side, overland through the valleys and rivers occasionally, or perhaps even by sea. So the picture on the right gives you an idea of some of the territory around there. And the red dots that you see in the picture on the right are some of the areas where they believe that the stones for the sarsen, for the bluestones came from. And again, that would have been a traverse of over 140 miles. Well, a couple of people who actually did some archaeology there were William Petrie Flinders and another guy by the name of Alexander Taffan. Now, Petrie made the first detailed survey of Stonehenge over a 6-year period, but he did no digging. He accurately got the first accurately surveyed down to a couple of inches accuracy, And he tried to come up with a calculation based on modern astronomical ideas, and he calculated that it was built in 730 AD. Alexander surveyed hundreds of small circles and ellipses and stone circles in Scotland and northern England long before he finally came to Stonehenge. He went over to Brittany over in France and surveyed those along with his sons, who are also very interested in that. Both of these guys didn't do any archaeology. All they could do was survey the area and try to preserve it for what as the way they found it. Well, Petrie made a contribution. He actually numbered the stones in his detailed survey. So all the uprights are numbered 1 through 30. You'll see a few other stones in here that are also kind of interesting. And you'll notice that the whole southern half here is down. There's really only 9 stones that have fallen, 4 that were taken away. A couple of the major sarsen, the major trilithon here that you see right in front of the picture here actually fell over due to the fact that somebody dug around it that didn't know what they were doing. These are stones now for the major, biggest trilithon that were 25 feet above the ground and up to 8 feet deep. The ordinary sarsens now were 13 feet tall, and they were only buried to a depth of about 4 feet. So something else was going on here. So not only do you see a circle of stones, but you see the horseshoe and the outer and inner blue stones that were put up. The stones were put up, built, rebuilt, taken down again, rebuilt several times during the course of 500 or 600 years as Stonehenge was put together. The one astronomer who came through there at the turn of the century now, Norman Lockyer, actually also tried to come up with a date for the origin of Stonehenge, and he calculated a date that was still off by about 500 years. Again, what we know now, and you're going to find out a little bit later on, is that the latest discoveries there have given it a far more ancient origin than was previously thought. Now, to explain what Hawkins did, I put together a couple of slides that show you what the sun does. Now, this is in the first 1 or 2 chapters of any astronomy book. And in the summer, we know the sun is very high up in the sky. It rises in the northeast and sets in the northwest. In the winter, it's very low in the sky. It rises in the southeast, sets in the southwest. In between these 2 solstice points, you have the sun coming up in the east only at the equinox and setting in the west. And that's just a basic bit of astronomy. If you plotted the sun's position on the ground according to the azimuth that you would come up with, you'd find out the midsummers, again, are up in the north, and the midwinter, sunrise and sunsets are down in the south. That's pretty much fixed. The sun's alignments, if you had a flat horizon or you created an artificial horizon, or if you were someone at Stonehenge, you would probably see just 4 positions for the sun. The moon, however, has an orbit that's inclined by about 5.15 degrees. And of course, it orbits the Earth in 29.53 days between full moon to the next full moon, or a new moon to the next new moon. And you would expect that there would be a northern position and a southern position. Well, the moon's orbit is a little bit different. In the summertime, it's very low across the sky. And in the wintertime, it transits very high in the sky. And again, the moon's orbit actually varies whenever you see those different positions over 18.6-year cycle, not the 19-year cycle. But the moon now can be anywhere in any of these 8 positions that you see on the right. It can actually make a 100-degree variation from in azimuth at one point in time, and then 9.5 years later, it makes transit across the azimuth or horizon of only about 60 degrees. So it's only because that the moon has an inclination that you're seeing that the moon precesses around that little inclined axis to the Earth over a period of 18.6 years. That produces 8 lines. So what do we have now? We have 4 fixed solar lines, and you can have a variable number of positions where the sun comes up in between either the 60-degree lines or the 100-degree azimuth line. And now comes Gerald Hawkins. He was born in England. He actually went to this military installation called Litchfield, which is about a mile away from Stonehenge. Even back in the First World War, there was an air base built there. And the legend has it, or the myth has it, that the pilots from World War I wanted to bomb Stonehenge because they thought it would be a hazard to their flights. Well, he published a book in 1966 after publishing a couple of papers in Nature, and those were done after starting to work with a computer to try to track down what was going on. By this time, he'd left England and now was working at Boston University as a full professor, and he had research capabilities over at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, where he had some assistance with an IBM archaic 7090 computer. And he wanted to find out whether or not there were any kind of some purpose behind these stones there. Now, the maps that he used, he very quickly found out that there are 165 different stones or gaps in stones or holes or other kinds of markers that were kind of interesting to work with. Well, if you wanted to go from stone to A to stone B and stone B back to A, you're going to get 2 different azimuths. And to incorporate all 165 stones and markers and holes, you'd end up with over 27,000 different positions to be evaluated. So he cut that down to 120 pairs of stones, which means if you go from stone A to B, you can also go from B to A and get a completely different azimuth. So his first endeavors were try to figure out the azimuths, and we now know that this is what the earliest phase of Stonehenge looked like. You would access it coming in through the avenue and the gap in the stone circles and cross over the ditch. And there are 4 stones in between that mark different positions. These were put in later. Some of them were actually on top of where the Aubrey stones were. This particular picture doesn't show the stones being put in there at that time, but there were actually 56 stones plus these other 4 station stones put in the earliest stage. Well, what did Hawkins find? So now, instead of the 165 stones, he computed pairs of 120 stones, and that gave him 240 azimuths. And all he did was extend those azimuths out into the sky and try to find what declination that they would point to. Not an RA or anything, but what declination. And he calculated for the era of about 1500 BC, because by that time, there were reports, published articles, and a lot of archaeology are already taking place that show that the Stonehenge was essentially complete and vacated by about 1500. Well, it was essentially completed in 2100, and the earliest constructions were from 2700 to about 2400, and only minor changes were made between 2100 and about 15 or 1600 BC. What he found were positions that correlated to the sun that gave you a declination of plus and minus 24. He also found a plus and minus 19 and a plus and minus 29. Well, the plus and minus 24 were related to the positions of the sun, and the moon now could vary between the plus and minus 19 to a plus and minus 29 declination. So now I'm not using the word azimuth, I'm using the word declination to find out the height of the sun or the moon as far as the sky is concerned. And this was significant because he then calculated that those 12 positions would correspond to the way Stonehenge was laid out. Now, to go even further now, Hawkins did another calculations around, again, based around 1500 BC, where you had the entire layout of, again, not showing the 56 Aubrey holes that were just inside the bank around Stonehenge. You'll see holes there for the X and Y, excuse me, the Y and Z holes. You'll see now the Saracens now in their full height between a circle of bluestones with an inner horseshoe of 19. So now the idea is that people, a limited number of people were able to approach and go inside Stonehenge to make observations. They were able to use the heel stone far out beyond the ditch itself and sight between perhaps two pillars, two stone Saracens that are outside there, and make their observation. Now, here now, you're not just at the center looking out, you're actually looking out from in between the giant trilithons. There's a large gap between the 30 Saracens that are in the outer circle, but there's only a small space just wide enough to stick your head through, and there's still 2 feet of stone for the large trilithons, and you can actually get to look in very fixed direction in 6 different directions. This is what Hawkins found now. Summer sunrise is at the plus 24 position at the top, and the sunset trilithon for winter now is at the 178 degrees different in azimuth, and that gives you the declination that corresponds to minus 24. There are the other 4 trilithons that give you either sunsets or sunrises across the northern half, or you could sight on those trilithons to see the positions of the moons through, all these lines now are through the very fixed positions of the Saracen circle of 30 stones. So putting those 2 ideas together, Hawkins published a list that's been expanded, excuse me, in his book, and it's more comprehensive than either of the 2 articles that are in Nature, and he ended up with a total of 15 lines that he thought corresponded from the center of Stonehenge to cross different positions for the original stone, what he called Stonehenge 1, and he ended up with 8 lines for Stonehenge 3, which was the finalized position with all the trilithons and all the Saracens all built together. But not all these lines are original in that there's some duplication, and not all these lines really work out entirely, but to get to this point, uh, they needed a little bit more of work, because here now he's just talking about sunrise and sunset for those 12 original lines that we thought that corresponded to the sun and the moon. Putting all that together, you can see the heel stone in the upper right, compass direction off to the north on the left, and you would expect you get 12 degrees of 12 different sighting lines to work with. Well, you have the ditch outside, the 56 Aubrey holes now, which were erected and taken down. You have the Y and the Z stones now that are 30 and 29. The idea now that Hawkins had was that either by using a stone in between the upright sarcens, you could count the 30 days approximately of the month. Well, a better idea would be to use the Y and Z holes and move a stone marker around these 29 and 30, and you would reset or recalibrate your calculation of when the full moon would occur by using those inner circles rather than using a marker at the outer lines. Still now you have different settings in there, and perhaps the area was cordoned off or prohibited from people from entering. So now this is what Hawkins would see from the inside, the sunrise over the heel stone. It actually rises on the horizon close to the ground where the first tip of the sun would appear nowadays. And approximately 4 minutes goes by before you would see the full disk of the sun over the horizon. You could also use the heel stone to track where the moon would rise. Not only that, if you are outside now, this is what the archaeologists have contributed, that viewed from the outside now, go back to 24 or 2100 BC, that you would see the midwinter sun framed in the gap between the top of the sarsen stones and the great trilithon, the largest 25-foot sarsen that's parked in the middle. You'd also be able to see an idea of where the moon would be. But again, the large stone just to the left of where the moon would be, it did fall down and break into a couple of pieces. So that's not going to be a view that we can obtain these today. Well, when Hawkins published his articles in Nature, he was contacted by one of the people that actually had participated in the excavations done by Colonel Hawley back in the 1920s. This was a guy by the name of Cecil Newham who said, "Hey, did you hear about this other guy? He's an amateur who's done some very interesting calculations." And in fact, Newham put Hawkins in touch with this guy, and they corresponded about their ideas. Now, Newham had an idea about these 4 station stones. He had also had an idea about the origins of different stones and some different ideas. He actually talked to Hawkins about the other stone alignments, and the word again, Newham and Newall put together an idea that what does the sun do or the moon do every 19 years? So there's another idea sprung in Hawkins' head about something else going on there. Hawkins had originally eliminated holes that are alphabetized A, B, C, D, E, and F. He added now to his calculations of stones B, C, and E, and he actually proved Newham's ideas that there are a lot more significant ideas. And he published another article in Nature magazine in 1964, after the first one came out in October of 1963. So the station stones are at the corners of this rectangle area. And it turns out that the Stonehenge tree, which incorporates the trilithons that are in the middle, has a center that's 3 feet offset from the center of the Sarsen circle. And it's the inner trilithons actually preserve quite a number of the sighting lines, but not all the sighting lines that are given in Stonehenge 1. Well, again, the moon can be, at the time of an equinox, can be anywhere from 5 degrees above where the sun comes up to an azimuth that's 5.1 degrees below where the sun comes up. So the short sides of that rectangle point to, what is it? Sunrise. Well, the long axes actually refer to different positions of the moon in either summer or the winter, according to their early ideas. Well, the Hatkins went even further. He made a computation now of where the winter full moon would rise based on this question now, what does the moon or the sun do every 19 years? Well, that we know is the Metonic cycle, known to the ancient Babylonians in 500 BC. And Hawkins tries to make the suggestion that that the people at Stonehenge now were actually able to track the moon by looking not just at the heel stone, but looking at the northeast where stone D was, or maybe even toward a little bit toward the southeast where stone F was, and keeping track of that. And there actually is some evidence to point out that they may have done something like that. Well, he made a calculation of where the moon would be, and he compared it to the only catalog that he could find for solar and lunar eclipses. And what Hawkins finds was that an eclipse always took place in the year when a full moon nearest the winter solstice rose over the heel stone. And that would indicate solstice periods or solstice times of the year when an eclipse would occur. Now, Hawkins made a mistake that he also thought that equinox type eclipses would occur when the moon rose over stone D or F. I'm strictly thinking about lunar eclipses because even though he calculated solar and lunar eclipses, it turns out that of those 20 solar eclipses, only one would have been even partially observable from the latitude of Stonehenge. And so the idea of using stone D or F to find out equinox type eclipses didn't work out. It doesn't also work out for lunar eclipses. But Hawkins still was unperturbed, and he tried to work out the 18.61 year variation between the moonrise over stone D, translating to the heel stone, then the rising over stone F 9.5 years later, and then working its way back over the heel stone north, and eventually returning to stone D in 18.6 years. So he proposed the idea of using these 3 stones to mark the time of year by simply observing the midwinter moon rise over the heel stone. That would indicate the danger period, or the closest either at a solstice in the June and December, or an equinox period to when an eclipse would occur, and those would be danger years. Now, Hawkins also tried to come up with a cycle there of 56 years because he was still trying to use the Aubrey holes to mark the cycle of eclipses. So he came up with a pattern of 9, 9, 10, 9, 9, 10 years, all of which adds up to 56 years, so that you could still put a marker stone on the Aubrey stones and then put another marker stone on those 29 and 30 blue stones that are inside the Sarsen circle, and actually figure out when the full moon was exact. And you would then be able to just simply observe the moon at those danger periods. And he actually came up with a calculator that you can build. So these are just 56 holes drilled into a piece of wood to follow the 9, 9, 10, 9, 9, 10, or 18, 19, 19, or 56 years of the Aubrey circles. Now, it doesn't quite work out. They actually tracked down a paper that by a professor emeritus up at Dartmouth called Malmstrom, and he sort of disproves the whole idea that the Hawkins as an eclipse predictor isn't working. Again, but it does work for lunar eclipses for winter full moons closest to the winter solstice that rise over the heel stone. There are approximately 23 full moons that took place in the time that Hawkins analyzed from 2000 to 1000 BC. Of those 23, 10 of them actually rose over the heel stone. And in 8 out of those 10 that rose over the heel stone, there was a lunar eclipse that you could have predicted. Again, you'd use the marker stone to find out when the eclipse season would occur, and you could know when to that would be a solstice eclipse, and you could certainly calculate the months accurately by the 29 and 30 holes. And then what about the day of a lunar eclipse? How could you predict that? Well, we know that if the moon was already in the sky when the sun was setting, that no eclipse would occur that day, and certainly wouldn't occur. Maybe it might occur for a couple of days. Similarly, if the moon was already below the horizon when the sun set, no eclipses would occur either. It was only when the moon rose at the time of sunset. So the Stonehenge people now had a way of figuring out the year when an eclipse would occur. They could in the month, season, if you want to call it that, they could calculate the times now from full moon to full moon, and they could simply observe the position of the moon at those eclipse danger periods to find out when an eclipse of the moon would occur. It doesn't work out very well according to Professor Malmstrom, but according to Hawkins' original ideas. Well, you can imagine that the archaeologists really didn't like this. The subtitle for Atkinson's paper here. Now, Atkinson was a distinguished professor who actually spent the late 50s and early 60s digging up things around Stonehenge. And his paper came out after Hawkins published his book. And he says, even though an astronomer examines Stonehenge, that this review article might be subtitled, "An Archaeologist Examines the Astronomer." It was an extremely bitter paper published in another journal called Antiquity. And it was an amazing bit of contact sport, because now it shows science really for what it is, as a knockdown, drag down contact sport, similar to football, only with stones. Well, Atkinson had done some serious work there in the 50s up till 76. He actually had raised some of the stones, which had started to be raised in 1901, again in Colonel Hawley's dangerous excavations in the 1920s, and cement footings were put in place. One of the things Hawken found was that one of the stones that was replaced, cemented and back in place, was skewed from where it should have been, and it was actually twisted a little bit from where it should have been to fit his theories. Hawkins now only claims something like a 2 or 2.5 degree accuracy, and that wasn't good enough for the archaeologists. Well, that corresponds to 4 full moons. Well, Atkinson had come up with the idea that Stonehenge 1, at the top of the picture here now, was built in somewhere by 2700 BC. What he called Stonehenge 2 added a few more stones, which were taken down and reassembled by the time that the Saracens were finally put in place, somewhere around 2100 BC. And a few more blowstones were put in between 1900 and 1600 BC. Atkinson had this idea that Stonehenge 3 was actually in 3 different phases. Modern archaeologists have now come up with 5 different phases with different kinds of subphases, and different groups have come up with different dates, all based on the same data. So when you look at some of the dates that you'll see in various articles and various websites, they don't always correspond, but they should now correspond to a more modern Stonehenge archaeology. Well, Atkinson was the first to find these images of daggers and axes that actually show up on 5 stones now, and there are like 110 different carvings. Atkinson found the first 2, and he developed an extensive theory that there was a guy that came into England from the Eastern Mediterranean and showed them how to put up stones. He actually theorized that the type of axe would only have been used in the area around Mycenae in Greece. And he has this whole extensive idea about a Mycenaean architect coming over and showing what he called, and he was criticized for calling the earliest Stonehenge people as howling barbarians. So this theory now of Atkinson's now was finally disproved in 1976, and people there had quite a bit of sophistication, not only just erecting and building these stones, but here you can see in the lower right a semicircle of an entranceway between Aubrey holes number 1 and 56. You see right in the gap of the ditch now, you'll see that the avenue that was filled in, there was probably a wooden structure there. And going out to the original road that you see out there, the heel stone is just inside the road. And notice to the left of the heel stone, there are 4 holes dug in the ground. Now these could align, and both Newham and Hawkins developed the idea that the people that were observing from inside Stonehenge could have put stone markers, small stone pillars in those holes to mark the motion of the moon across a part of that 18.61 year cycle. So there is some evidence that they could have developed the idea of the 18.61 year motion of the moon. But the 19-year cycle now has to refer to the time between one full moon and another full moon, or one new moon and the subsequent new moon 19 years later, that was developed and thought about in 500 BC by the ancient Babylonians. Well, Hawkins sets aside the idea of whether or not the people that built Stonehenge knew about the 19-year cycle. He was not the only one to write a book about Stonehenge. Fred Hoyle, whose name you'll recognize, also came out He was contacted by the editor of Nature magazine about this controversy that they were experiencing with the papers written by Hawkins. Well, you also remember Hoyle as having coined the term Big Bang Theory to ridicule the this first instant of creation, which was beginning to be popularly accepted by all the astronomers of the 1960s. Hoyle now supported Hawkins' work and actually said that Hawkins' work is accurate to plus minus half a degree. And he also published an article in Antiquity first, and about before he published his own book in about 1976, 1977. Hoyle now goes through an extensive analysis to try to come up with a 19-year cycle, and where Hawkins said, well, you leave it to others to prove it, Hoyle tried to prove that 19-year periodicity, and he came up with his own ideas in an article published in Nature in 1966, now fully 2 years after Hawkins' book came out. So he tries to come up with his own plus or minus 24 azimuth, plus or minus 24 declination for the sun, and plus or minus 19 or up to plus minus 29 declination for motions of the moon. So he sort of agrees with a lot of the lines that Hawkins comes up because he used Hawkins' data. He came up with his own calculator, and now instead of 3 stones moving around the circle in the same direction, he uses 4 stones, 2 of which represent the nodes of the moon's orbit, one of which represents the sun moving counterclockwise, and the one for a stone for the moon, or peg for the moon. And to keep it really accurate, he says you need another board with 29 holes built into it. That begs the question of whether or not the Stonehenge people could even conceive of the idea of nodes and orbits. And so I like Hawkins' ideas for just using sight lines, but I don't necessarily agree with Hoyle's idea now of trying to interpret it based on more modern astronomy. Well, the question now about the 19-year cycle really is kind of immaterial, because there probably were attempts to calculate it, but not actually being very successful. The oldest parts of Stonehenge, as I said, was a set of 4 posts dug into the ground across from Stonehenge in the old car park lot. There are 2 circular areas here called cursuses, which are either the greater cursus right north of Stonehenge in this picture, or a smaller one. The greater one is like 1 3/4 miles long. And Stockley, who first noticed this particular, as well as the Aubrey holes, said that this was a Roman racetrack. Well, it follows the pattern of Stonehenge and of earlier monuments of having a ditch dug out of the chalk and excavated to form a bank, and which is the same basic pattern that you saw for the Stonehenge and different areas where people had lived originally. Off to the right now, in the upper right corner, you'll see a place called Durrington Walls and Woodhenge, of which I've shown you pictures. And there's also a little Woodhenge kind of a little Stonehenge kind of a structure made out of bluestones in front of Durrington Walls. And this is a site where people who had built Stonehenge had lived. Modern archaeologists have only dug this up in the last 10, 12 years, and that commemorates the area where the original houses. There could have been anywhere from 400 to 1,000 houses built at Durrington Walls, and there were 2 timber circles inside of Durrington Walls that gave them practice on sunrises and sunsets, as well as that Woodhenge. The idea now that archaeologists are coming up with is that Barrington Walls represents where the people or the land are living, as opposed to the Stonehenge area, which was the land of the dead, because there were people buried in the Aubrey holes, or cremations put into the Aubrey holes, as well as a couple of bodies and cremations that were buried in the ditch at Stonehenge. So now the archaeologists say that the midwinter sunrise was more significant, and that would be cause for people to gather together from all across England, not just the local area, but well out to Wales in the far west, all the way up to Scotland in the far north. Not only that, they may have brought cremated bones from their ancestors that they wanted buried at Stonehenge, and it's some sort of a celebration. And they would have marched across the blue line there, which is the River Avon, and coming out at a place called the Blue Stonehenge, which was built for a while, taken down, and those stones were reappropriated, just like any blue stones that were at Barrington Walls were incorporated into Stonehenge. The avenue now is an excavation because it does follow the low-lying areas, so that larger stones could have been dragged in that area, or from if they came up on the river route, or, for example, if the Marlborough Downs, which was the site for the large sarsen stones, those would have only come in 25 to 20 mile an hour journeys from the north down to Stonehenge. Well, there's a couple of other very ancient places in here, one of which I've noted by that purple dot there, Blickmead, actually had an ancient civilization living in the Stonehenge area of hunter-gatherers there who were only there temporarily while they gathered flints for their arrows and spears, so they could hunt not just in the valleys but up on the Salisbury Plain, which was at their time 5,000 years before Stonehenge was ever built in Stonehenge 1, to be an ancient gathering place for people. There's another place in between the purple dot there for Blickmead, which had a spring that never froze. Off to the left of that, and sort of halfway between there and Stonehenge, you see another place called Conyberry, where another group of people did settle down for a while. And in fact, just below that purple dot, the Romans built their camp, probably for the access to that spring that never froze. And Vespasian had his army stationed there. And those were the two extremes of building here. Next to the left of Stonehenge, you see called a palisade. These were wooden stakes that were put into holes in the ground. Different areas now that you can't see on this kind of a map are the approximately 375 barrows that were burial places that were put into that surrounding area. Either the long rectangular stone and dirt barrows, or the simple, more complex burial that were put in a round kind of a figure in that area. In fact, if you extend out beyond that region of where Stonehenge now, you hit over 600 burial sites across the whole spot called the Greater Stonehenge area. Well, it turns out that Colonel Hawley back in the 1920s dug up approximately half of the holes that were called attention to first by John Aubrey, and he found some bones in there, but cremated bones, and those were all gathered together, put into 4 leather patches, and reburied at the position of Aubrey hole number 7. The gentleman whose back is to you and closest to the camera is a gentleman by the name of Mike Parker Pearson. You can't see any National Geographic or Science Channel program without seeing dear old Mike Parker Pearson getting his ideas here. And on the right now, I've finally shown a picture of a typical long barrel where maybe 30 to 40 people were buried in the bottom, which is the east end of that greater cursus, and a typical kind of round burial where a single individual, or perhaps even one or two people were buried in what was called the typical burial, a roundish kind of point. But these bones now are made, accounted for approximately 200 individuals may have eventually been buried in the Aubrey holes, and they searched through those bones to find out about 23 different bones of all the same area in the human body. And it turns out that the analysis now shows that 14 of those 23 people came from Wales, where the bluestones came from. Well, again, this is why we have an idea now that why Stonehenge was built here, because of these recent excavations, not just because of the summer sunrise aligned over the heel stone, but in fact, across the street, across the road now, you see these trenches that were actually put in there and caused by the melting of glaciers in between two folds of the chalk formations. And it's not a rare occurrence because another similar fold aligned on the sunrise in the summer occurs elsewhere. So that now in 2013, when they dug up the road and returned it to its natural state, you have other things happening there. Ground penetrating radar and LiDAR shows that there was a system of 20 deep holes well outside of Stonehenge itself. And in fact, these were not the first deep holes built at Stonehenge, because back in 1964, an archaeologist had found another remnant of a hole, which is 105 feet deep. It's approximately an outer diameter of 20 feet, tapering down to 6 feet, then going down to 105 feet below through chalk, and all dug out by antler bits and pounding of stones. You essentially pound that antler into the chalk, pull it upright, and you do this all day long for 10 and 55 years before you end up making a significant impact on the grounds here. They actually also found another circular enclosure to the northwest of Stonehenge called the Larkhill enclosure, or the Causeway enclosure. And all of these were essentially found with the newer discoveries that were made at Stonehenge. So it turns out that those blue stones were actually quarried between 3300 BC and 3000 BC, and then transported someplace to Stonehenge, which is off on the far left of this picture. The people here now were living at the Durrington Walls to build Stonehenge. They also had temporary structures, which they're probably not occupied all year long, but they came together at the midwinter to celebrate. And this was the BYOP party, to bring your own pig. Analysis of the pig bones shows that they all died around the age of 9 months in a fantastic celebration at Durrington Walls, so that they actually feasted on the pigs, most of which were brought in, and a few cattle that they might have brought also as well, besides the cattle or pigs that were raised locally. Well, the new timeline gives you sort of Stonehenge 1 was pretty much built by 2900 now, compared to what Atkinson. By 2100, Stonehenge 3 was already pretty much built, except they now call it Stonehenge 4, and nothing much happens for 500 years until about 9. that later period? Well, the different kinds of excavation projects are Stonehenge Riverside Project, the Hidden Landscapes Project, uh, Wessex Archaeology did a lot of studies there. And for now, since they did not excavate in the inside, the area of Stonehenge, which is now off limits for till the future, that everything at the present time is now an ongoing lab study. Well, I can recommend one book for you to read, and that's not it. This is not the book to buy, read. This gentleman is a geophysicist type of archaeologist who's into mapping. He spent a lot of his own money on trying to develop a computer program which would analyze Stonehenge with drawing circles and arcs and coming up with an axis. So now you have the, looks like a little bullseye there, A1, A2, forming the main axis. He assumes is 180 degrees, and I already told you that that's not true. The astronomical alignment is 178 degrees at Stonehenge, not 180 degrees. But Johnson here uses the 180 degree axis, and by drawing various arcs according to his theories, you could find out where the edges of the trilithons would go. But again, if I use the carpentry analogy, if I wanted to put a stone down, I might want to know where the center would go more than the end. Well, this is not the book to recommend because he ignores a lot of the astronomical implications of Stonehenge. But there is a book that I can recommend if you really want to make sense of this, and it is written by Mike Parker Pearson, who's unquestionably quite the authority on Stonehenge. And it's available through Amazon. You can get it in cloth bound, soft bound. It's really an interesting book. So I want to leave you with one book to read, not just those two, and be aware that archaeology and astronomy are still at loggerheads with each other, and it's a contact sport. And so if there's any questions, please feel free to inquire. I know John has a bunch of questions already. Go ahead.
Wow, that was something else.
Well, you did ask for to give me plenty of time.
I did.
So,
I did. I didn't expect 54 slides, but wow, I'm impressed. Pete was to speak at the last Connecticut Star Party last year in the morning of all things. It was Dick Parker and I camped together, as you most know, and Friday night was the only night that we had a clear sky. So believe us, we weren't getting up and blueberry pancakes were crawling. But he came back and I asked him how it went, and we had a 45-minute discussion over our campsite, and I just said, we need to do this more. We need to do this at a meeting, and I am not disappointed. Is there anyone that has questions? They could either chat or just ask to speak. Just remember to unmute yourself and try not to speak all at once. Anyone?
Actually, I've shortened it. I shortened the program and fine-tuned it to your specifications to concentrate on the newest discoveries at Stonehenge, and all of which, or most of which, are described in that book by Mike Parker Pearson. But it's been kind of a fascinating project here because there's no end of websites to go to, no end to books. No one can read all the books. But it captured Hawkins' attention because he worked there a mile away at Larkhill before going over to Boston and becoming a professor there. So the whole controversy there between the archaeologists and the astronomers is kind of an ongoing thing, basically, because they only believe this one guy who was an archaeologist astronomer called Clive Ruggles. And nobody believes any of the other astronomers that are beginning to see alignments in there. And in fact, They have uncovered solar alignments at Durrington Walls, because that, again, that's a henge built on top of where the houses were originally, that when people built it. It's not the end point of anything, but it's certainly, there's no end of things, that tangents that anybody could take in finding out more about Stonehenge. And I sort of don't recommend going off the straight and narrow path here, but you can still also try to get a hold of Hawkins' book, and which is an enhanced version of the 2 or 3 papers that he's written on this topic. Hoyle's book is also available, and it's harder to find Atkinson's book, but it is available sometimes on Amazon. So if there's any further questions, I know I've kept you busy for an hour and a half here, but
Thanks, Pete. I think Scott's getting ready to ask one.
okay.
Well, I'm just musing that even with the construction of Stonehenge 1, you have to wonder how many generations of people observing,
Hmm.
how many rocks did they keep in a pouch, and how did they keep track of their observations, and to come up with something that can still be such a puzzler to modern technology to figure out. And well, it was all built by aliens anyway. We all know that. So
Oh,
Well,
Yeah,
well, here,
there's
if I can ask a question, because I guess I've kind of grown up with the belief, from popular modern mythology, that this was all built by druids. And apparently, one of the first things you said is that the druids came 1,000 years after Stonehenge was completed. So we're talking a fairly advanced society that, like Scott said, this was some heavy calculations that had to go in over many, many, many years of time to get all the angles correct, all the dates correct, you know, before they even put the stones into the ground. I mean, what who was there at the time? 2,800 years ago, who were the ancient Britons?
well, the Neolithic genes only in modern Britons only account for like 10% of the DNA. They were actually assimilated by the Bell Beaker people who came in afterwards, and it was a friendly incorporation. Hawkins has a terrific quote there about between 6,000 and 2,000 BC, people in various parts of the world, I made that politically correct, people in various parts of the world invented and put to use the plow, the wheel, inclined plane, lever, the arch, weaving, pottery making, copper smelting, and most importantly, beer brewing. If you look at some of the pictures, there were ways to keep track of the full moon,
Hmm.
a piece of bone. Also, there was there are no similar carvings like that found at Stonehenge. And people were living there 5,000 years before they uh, started even building the Stonehenge. People like Atkinson now could not believe that Stonehenge is so unique. There's nothing else like it. There are no precursors, according to Atkinson.
Hmm.
Well, they are in wood, which does decay.
Right.
And perhaps maybe somebody can find something there that in wood. But this was part of my CST presentation, which I didn't incorporate. But there are all kinds of circular stones in Scotland where the art of pottery making came down, and it was developed even further by the Bell Beaker people who came in after and assimilated the Neolithic people. But it was an interesting and friendly takeover of that whole area. So I would assume that There are smaller stone circles, especially if you read Aubrey Burrell or Alexander Thom's books, where he surveyed hundreds of them across Scotland and even Ireland long before he came to Stonehenge. And these were half circles or squashed ellipses, and he tried to come up with his own theories about how they could have used them to, but again, sight on fixtures that were on the horizon rather than within the circles. But
Sure.
but now with Stonehenge, you actually have a sight line with stones that are in your foreground instead of having to go all the way down to the horizon like Tom would have you believe. Any other questions?
I'd like to thank you, Pete, for taking the time from our fireside chat, or pancake side chat, I should say. Yes, indeed. Scott's got it right. Do a round of applause here.
Yeah.
This was a longer presentation than we usually have, but certainly one of our best. Next month won't be anything like this because our speaker is very animated, likes to speak with his hands, and uses props. Tom Field from Field Tested Systems will be taking scientific research that the amateur can do with spectroscopy and making it fun. I've attended his talk now 4 times, plus his private talks for the people that use his product like I do. And I've gone to an AVBSO meeting where he's talked and Silvera meeting where he's talked. He can get animated, make spectroscopy fun. And it's not expensive if you do it his way and not my way.
I also got to throw in one comment. As you know, OSIRIS-REx, the NASA probe, did touch down and grab a sample from asteroid Bennu last night.
Yes, passing the live briefings on to the membership.
PBS has a program on now at 9 o'clock, and it's repeated at 1 a.m. So you can set your VCRs to touch down on an asteroid or touching an asteroid. Hopefully that wasn't a gunshot. But,
touching an asteroid, it's called?
Yeah, it's on at 9 o'clock on CPTV, and again, it's repeated at 1 a.m. So you don't have to stay up and watch that. But
well,
it may have some of the
started.
Insight onto some of the hottest topics that are going on right now. But again, I want to thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy to participate in the meeting. I'm looking forward. I'm going to try to get to that next month's meeting as well.
Yeah,
you're more than welcome to join us. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.
Give us back your screen.
Good nobbing.